All right, good evening or afternoon, morning, depending on where you are dialing in from. Welcome to the next in our series of webinars at WSET School London. My name is Julia Lambeth. I am one of the educators at WSET School London. I teach mainly wines, but have a firm interest in all other drinks, really. So I am very much looking forward to talking to you about alternative Australia this evening. Just to give you a little bit of background on why this as a topic, I guess the main thing is that I really like Australian wines. I think a few of you do too, which is why you're here. I was lucky enough a few years ago to go over to Australia. I actually won a blind tasting competition that was hosted by Wines of Australia, and that gave me the opportunity to go over, do a little trip, wine tasting trip, taste loads of awesome wines, and for someone who was already keen on Australian wines, that really just cemented it. And this was sort of one of the takeaways from that trip, the idea of alternative Australia, that there are producers planting grape varieties or doing things slightly differently to the norm, to what we've seen historically. So following on from that, my plan had been, well, earlier in the year I was planning to do a tasting at our building at the school near London Bridge. However, as you all know, that didn't happen. So the next best thing is this. I'm going to talk about some of these alternative grape varieties, alternative wines, with the hope to one day tasting once again. So starting at the beginning with just a bit of an introduction to what I mean by alternative here. So we're going to look at lots of different grape varieties as part of this session. So some will focus on a little bit more, some is just more of a kind of mention. But by alternative, it's really not the usual. So when we think of the more popular grape varieties in Australia, obviously we're talking about Shiraz and Chardonnay, but there's also Cabernet Sauvignon, Merlot, Grenache, Riesling, Semillon, and so on, all of the sort of international varieties that you'll find in many other countries as well. So when we're talking about alternative grape varieties, it means anything else, really. So we're looking at varieties that are planted in quite small quantities. Some of them are more regionally specific than others, but all of them are interesting. Some have been actually planted for a long time. I'll have a little brief overview of the history, and then some of them have only really started production in the last few years. So it is quite a diverse scene in terms of grape varieties. That's going to be the focus of the session, the grape varieties, and at the end I also just want to touch a little bit on grape growing and winemaking as well, just because really it all kind of feeds in together. So let's start with that little bit of history. So winemaking in Australia can be sort of traced back to, well, quite a long time ago. It was 1832 that James Busby arrived in Australia with a collection of vine cuttings that he would taken from several countries in Europe. In fact, this wasn't the first planting of vines. There had been some a few decades earlier, but it was when Busby arrived in Australia, he really realised the potential of the country for wine production. And at that point, it wasn't really a wine trade. So he took it upon himself to go back to Europe to learn about winemaking. He wrote a whole book. It's actually quite impressive if you ever want to read it. And yeah, he basically brought back a bunch of different grape varieties, not all of which survived. As I just mentioned, some of the varieties became more popular than others, but to start off with, it was quite an expansive collection. So moving on to a couple of decades later, we get to 1868, and we get the first Dolcetto planted in Australia by Henry Best. So Dolcetto is an Italian grape variety, and it is still considered an alternative grape variety today, even though it's been planted for that long. And in fact, that vineyard has been running for ever since that time. It's possible that the world's oldest Dolcetto is actually in Australia rather than in Italy. I don't know if that's 100% true, but that's the theory. But it just goes to show you that, yeah, the idea of alternative isn't a new one, although it is a growing one, and there is a growing number of grape varieties and a growing proportion of alternative grape varieties, as we'll look at later. So even by 1868, we had some alternative varieties, but by the early 1900s, the focus was on these international varieties. So as I said, the Shiraz and Chardonnay sort of became really popular. Fortified wines at this time are actually really important. So you might not think of Australia for its fortified wines, but way back when, those were definitely the styles that were more desirable. So wines like sherry, wines like port, they obviously won't call them sherry and port anymore, but in that sort of style. And it would have been different grape varieties typically that we use for those. As we get into the late 1900s, here is where plantings start to expand. So grape varieties like Viognier start to be planted. You can think of Yolumba in Eden Valley planting Viognier, which until that point wasn't really a variety that had been considered much for Australia. So now it's not that unusual. I think we even saw someone in the chat earlier is drinking some Viognier tonight, but at that time it hadn't been considered part of the key crop of grape varieties for the country. So already things are starting to change. And then we've got a couple of particular dates. Coriole, the winery in McLaren Vale, plant the first Sangiovese. These guys have taken a real interest in Italian varieties. So not only will you find Sangiovese there, but you've got Barbera, Nebbiolo, Fiano, all sorts of things going on. And then this focus on Italian varieties continues, so we get to 2000, where the Chalmers winery imports 70 Italian varieties. So those of you that maybe haven't had much Italian wine and think 70 varieties, oh, that's a lot. I mean, it is a lot, but it's also not all the Italian varieties. These will be the ones that were deemed most likely to be successful in the Australian climate. So one of the things we're going to talk about a little bit later is why import all these different varieties, and part of the answer to that is a climatic one. When you think about the growing conditions in many parts of Italy, particularly some of the central and southern ones, you're looking at quite warm, dry growing conditions, and that mirrors in many ways many of the Australian regions. So it just makes more sense in a lot of ways to start importing these varieties which are going to be naturally more suited to the climate. While the existing international varieties can work in the climate, you might find that actually there are some better options out there. So yeah, already we can see how quite rapidly the number of grape varieties starts to change over the course of a few years. So in terms of what constitutes an alternative grape variety, looking on the Wine Australia website, an easy definition that I found is that it's all varieties that are not mainstream or extensively planted. So you don't need to have a particular number or criteria. It's just anything that's not one of those key grape varieties. And this has been a consideration for several years. Wine Australia released in 2017 a sort of list of ones to watch, the alternative varieties that they thought would be really successful. And you can see a few key ones there. Nero, which definitely is very successful, and we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail later. Tempranillo, definitely successful. In fact, I was reading some stats earlier, and this has made it into the top 10 black grape varieties in terms of crush this year. Yeah, I think it was this year. Anyway, it's definitely grown in the amounts being produced. So whether this means that Tempranillo should actually no longer be considered an alternative grape variety, I am not sure. But I will leave you to make your own judgments on that. Vermentino and Fiano, both Italian varieties. Vermentino we'll talk a little bit more about later, but both of them again just kind of suited to these warm climates, but still making wines that are refreshing, fruity, that have this lovely concentration of flavour. Since 2017, there's more grapes. So there's increasing plantings of things like Nebbiolo, Italian variety Touriga Nacional from Portugal, Assyrtiko from Greece, Grüner Veltliner from Austria, Sangiovese back to Italy, and that's, you know, that's barely scratching the surface, and more. I mean, you can think of what else can we say? Some of the Northern Rhone varieties, Marsanne and Roussanne, which historically haven't had a great proportion of plantings. What else was I thinking about earlier? Saperavi, Georgian grape variety, Sagrantino, another less known Italian grape variety, Zinfandel, mentioned earlier. I mean, yeah, the list just keeps on going. So very much speaking to this idea of experimentation in Australia. So in 2015, which is actually the most recent statistics I could find for volume of vineyard area, the overall alternative grape varieties made up 7.3%. So it's not a lot. Arguably it will have grown, but I just don't have any more up-to-date stats. But it means that when we're looking at each of these grape varieties, actually it's quite a small volume of production that we're looking at. Nevertheless, as an overall picture, it is an interesting thing to consider, and it's certainly a thing I think that's going to become more and more important over the coming years. So, coming back to this question of why plant alternative grape varieties, why not just stick to the Chardonnay and Shiraz that we all know and love? There's a few potential reasons for this. So the first one here is innovation as an idea. Australian winemakers, like many winemakers around the world, like to experiment. They like to change things up. They like to see what they can do. Most winemakers will have worked in another place. They will have gained experience from that. They may have worked with different grape varieties. They can see how that works in Australia, how they can make it their own. Another thing that will back this up is that, of course, in Australia we don't have legal connections between regions and grape varieties. So if you think about regions in Europe, in France, in Italy, in Spain, the laws there mean that you can't plant just anything. You actually can't experiment so much and then to keep within the laws of the region. But in Australia they don't have that. So it's another slight difference here that means that they can really do whatever they want. If it's Nebbiolo they've set their hearts on, why not give it a go? The next point here is as a response to climate change. So climate change is obviously having influences on vineyards around the world, and in Australia it can mean a number of different things. Can mean warmer, shorter, drier growing seasons, and the grape varieties, again the international varieties that are planted, are really not always suited to these conditions. They're going to need somewhere that's not too warm. They're going to need somewhere with an ample water supply. So looking to the future and thinking about the needs of the vines versus what's going to be available, it does make more sense to start looking at other grape varieties which may be better suited naturally to the growing conditions that are expected in Australia. And then, of course, the other side of that is if you have grape varieties that are better suited to production, then you're not going to need to use so much water in your vineyard. You can manage them a little bit more sustainably, and that will also kind of lead into the ethics of your business if you're concerned about climate change. And the last point about the globalization of wine comes from both the producer and the consumer side. So I mentioned earlier that a lot of winemakers work in several different countries. So they will have gained experience from working in other places and bring that back to them. And then you'll find that we've got people from other countries living in Australia. So they will bring with them a demand for wines that maybe didn't exist historically a few years ago, a few decades ago. And then you've also got people around the world who are exposed to all sorts of wines. So big wine markets like the UK, America, China are actually some of the biggest consumers of these alternative varieties. But that's because generally we have access to all sorts of wines. So we'll have an idea of what a Sangiovese tastes like in Italy, but then it becomes a bit more of a different thing. What does Sangiovese taste like in Australia? How are the two going to be able to compare? So it's a few factors sort of tying that together. So from having this idea that you want to plant some alternative varieties, you think you can make a good wine, you think there's a market for it, we've then got to think about some of the practicalities. How do you get new grape varieties into a country? It's not as simple as James Busby's day. You can't just go around on your ship and bring them back. Nowadays, if you're bringing any new organic material into the country, it has to undergo quarantine. This is a word we're all familiar with now, but this has been in existence for a long time before our current status here. And also quarantine for this organic material is normally much longer. So you're looking at generally 2 years quarantine before you're able to access any cuttings. And the reason for this is to ensure the health of any cuttings that you bring over. If you've done much wine studying, you'll know that several diseases, pests have been spread around the world due to poor hygiene practices, due to no one checking enough whether there was anything wrong with them. So things like phylloxera, you may know about, kind of powdery mildew, Pierce's disease. There's a number of things that have been spread which could potentially have been more contained. So this really strict quarantine is part of that process. After the grapes have survived their 2-year quarantine period, then they're able to be planted. Of course, you can't make wine with the grapes straight off, so you have to wait a couple of years. You'll also have to try and propagate your cuttings. So from the cuttings that have survived the quarantine, you then need to have enough to create a vineyard's worth, or enough of a vineyard to create as much wine as you want to create. So it's going to take a few years to really get these going and to get the right number of vines ready to produce fruit. And then after that, well, then you've got to start experimenting really with the grape variety that you've got, seeing if it's producing the right amount of flavours, the right balance of acidity or tannin, thinking about if it's suited to this particular soil or has the right amount of water or sunlight or heat. Experimenting in the winery in terms of fermentation vessels or fermentation temperatures or extraction. All of these things, you know, it's normally not going to be the first time you get it perfectly right. So yeah, experimentation and suitability sort of spoke about in the same sentence there. And really, I guess the final conclusion will be, you know, can you make an authentically Australian representation of this grape variety? There needs to be something about it that is unique, is different. You're not just making a copy of whatever is done in Italy or Spain or Portugal. So there's quite a lot to consider. Sounds kind of like fun. I'm sure I'm sure it's actually quite a lot of hard work, but having the opportunity to create something new is not something that most winemakers get to do every day. So from here, I just wanted to focus on a few of those grape varieties that I mentioned earlier. We would be here for a long time if I tried to talk about all of them, so I'm not going to do that. But some of those key grape varieties that were mentioned from 2017, and then a couple of others that have become more important over the intervening years. So starting with Vermentino. So Vermentino, for anyone who is not familiar with it, is an Italian white grape variety. So it's found in coastal parts of Liguria, in Sardinia, Corsica, and it makes dry white wines which have generally quite a high acidity, and a combination of sort of peachy, bit of stone fruit, bit of citrus fruit, and delicate floral characteristics. It is generally a single varietal wine. Okay, can be blended, but generally we're not looking at oak or any massive winemaking techniques here. It's a wine that just has a lovely varietal character that people like. If it's not one that you're familiar with, it often appeals to fans of Sauvignon Blanc. So if you like that sort of dry, refreshing, aromatic style of wine, then it's definitely one for you to look out for. So tried to get some stats in where I could for the presentation. For Vermentino, as I mentioned earlier, the latest stats of 2015, only 121 hectares planted, which is 0.1% of the entire Australia vineyard area. So yeah, so not a particularly high volume in terms of its production. But like with all of these things, it is important, it is growing. The Chalmers vineyard I mentioned earlier, those were the guys that imported those 70 Italian grape varieties in 2000, and they were the first to import Vermentino into Australia. Now, apparently over 100 wineries are growing some amount of Vermentino, so it is something that we can, I'd say, expect to see more of in the near-ish future. And for each of these key varieties that I'm going to just try and talk about a little bit more, I've picked up, I picked out a few of the wineries that are producing them, again courtesy of Wine Australia for their useful help with this. So we can see some in Heathcote, some in McLaren Vale, at Oliver's Tauranga, Trentham Estate in Murray-Darling, Parish Hill in Adelaide Hills, Perna in Clare Valley. So quite a range of different places, quite a range of different climates in those places. So you can imagine there are already a few different styles of Vermentino emerging from within Australia. The next grape variety I'd like to mention is Grüner Veltliner, and largely because Grüner Veltliner isn't an Italian variety. It's not one of these which was selected to be suited to the warm, dry climates of Australia, that kind of focus on climate change that I mentioned earlier. Actually, Grüner Veltliner is a native Austrian grape variety. And if you know much about Austria, you know that it's cooler than Italy. So it's actually a grape variety that is not quite so widely planted. You need to find somewhere that does have a cooler growing environment that's not so warm to be suited to this particular grape variety. So you can see here we've got a few places. Adelaide Hills is definitely leading the charge for Grüner Veltliner at the moment, but also a bit in Canberra and Tasmania as well. In terms of bringing Grüner Veltliner to Australia, that was actually the Handorf Hills Winery. They imported a number of different clones to Adelaide Hills, again obviously going through the various quarantine and nursery processes that I mentioned, and were able to really recognise the suitability of Grüner Veltliner as a grape variety to the growing conditions and the climate in Adelaide Hills. If you're not so familiar with Adelaide Hills, this is a sort of sub-region within South Australia, but it's at higher altitude compared to some of its neighbouring regions. I always feel like the clue is in the name there, but just in case you weren't familiar. So being higher altitude means that we have cooler growing conditions. We have a bit more of a diurnal range as well. So we have these quite warm, sunny days and then cooler evenings, which allows the grapes to build up flavour slowly, but also maintain acidity. So while it was the Handel Hill winery that really started it off, there are now a number of different producers that are making wine, as you can see. And it comes in a variety of styles. Actually, this was one of the grape varieties that I was able to do a tasting of when I was out in Australia. And what we found was that you've got some wineries making wines which are, again, varietal focused. So stainless steel fermentation, cool temperatures, making these nice refreshing styles of wine. Others are going for slightly riper grapes, so you get more of a kind of textural, richer element. And then some styles doing more skin contact, thinking about manipulating the skins, using the skins in with the fermentation, so basically like an orange wine instead, and that creates another distinct style. So yeah, all sorts of things going on. The best examples that I think I've tried managed to keep the sort of herbaceous characteristics of Grüner Veltliner. So it's quite famous for having this kind of peppery, white pepper characteristic, some sort of herbaceous notes, but still with quite a well-defined fruit character, citrus, green fruits, maybe some stone fruits as well. And you can really find some wineries that are exhibiting that very nicely. So you've got a few examples there. Incidentally, Handel Hill also growing some Austrian black varieties as well. So if you're interested in any Blaufränkisch or Zweigelt in Australia, those are the guys to go to. And then a few others there as a reference as well. On to a couple of black grape varieties. So Nero was one of the grape varieties that was sort of mentioned in 2017 as one of the ones to watch. And this is a grape variety from southern Italy, widely grown in Sicily. So if we think about southern Italy in terms of its climate, yeah, now we're looking at some places that are pretty warm and dry. So it does again explain why this is a grape variety that is suited to growing here. In fact, when I was doing some reading about Nero in Australia, I came across a page on James Halliday's website talking about the suitability of Nero and it basically said, if you were to try and create a grape variety, try to imagine a grape variety that would be best suited to Australia right now, what you would probably come up with is Nero so we're quite lucky that it exists already. So part of that is down to its ability to suit the climate. Part of that is down to the style of wine it makes. Lovely fruity characters, sort of red fruits typically, but not too high in alcohol, not too full-bodied, not too big. There is a slight trend towards wines that aren't too overpowering in Australia at the moment. So something that is more medium-bodied, that isn't quite so much of a hit you around the face style, is something that, again, in theory, is what consumers are looking for, what winemakers are looking for. So that all of it kind of makes sense in terms of why it's growing in popularity. And it's another one of the grape varieties that was imported by the Chalmers family. So they again were responsible for its origin, but again it has grown. So now more than 55 vineyards have plantings of Nero d'Avola. I think it will continue to expand as well. That said, it's not been without a little bit of controversy. So you might notice on the label for the Coriol bottle that we've got on the slide there that it just says Nero. And I imagine that might be in part due to some protest from Italy that has occurred, basically saying that using the term Nero d'Avola on a bottle of Australian wine is misleading. Partly because Avola is a place, so the name of the grape variety Nero d'Avola is just because it's a black grape variety from Avola, and also partly because apparently Australian producers were referencing Sicily or Sicilian in a lot of their descriptions, so that Italy is worried it's going to confuse consumers. They might be expecting something from Italy and actually get something from Australia instead. Of course, this isn't the first time these sorts of concerns have occurred. You may remember Prosecco. It's very much the same thing. Prosecco should just be made in Italy. You can't just make Prosecco anywhere in the world. The resolution from that was they changed the name of the grape variety from Prosecco to Glera, and told everyone to stop calling it Prosecco. And there still exist a few Proseccos in Australia, but I'm sure they're not supposed to. Anyway, slight tangent there. Despite this little bit of controversy, it doesn't stop some lovely wines being made. So again, you can see a few examples there from Coriol in McLaren Vale, Chalmers and Heathcote, Rush Higgins in McLaren Vale, and Montera in Fleurieu Peninsula. Noticeably, these are all places that are warmer compared to where we were just looking for the Grüner Veltliner plantings. They are definitely grape varieties that have different requirements in terms of their vineyard, but it doesn't mean that both of them aren't equally important and equally relevant for Australia going forward. And then onto Nebbiolo. Nebbiolo has one of the key black grape varieties from Piemonte in the north of Italy. So if you are familiar with Italian wines, you've probably had some Nebbiolo, maybe in the form of Barolo or Barbaresco, or maybe from somewhere else. But what is noticeable about pretty much all Nebbiolo wines is they make very complex, concentrated, structured wines. Often the aroma profile that you get from a Nebbiolo would be described as rose petals and tar, with fruity characteristics, spicy characteristics, oak notes. Yeah, pretty big wines. And no one would argue that they don't make some very important, very outstanding quality wines. Nebbiolo is a grape variety. It's not the easiest grape variety to grow. It needs a long growing season. Where you find it in Piemonte is only in the best sites, only on the best slopes. If you don't have just the right growing conditions, you risk not getting the grapes ripe enough. And so, yeah, you might wonder, why would you try growing a grape variety that can be such a challenge, that can be so risky? But I think coming back to that point earlier of innovation, and yeah, some people do like a challenge. We've got the label from the Julia Lambeth Nebbiolo there in Yarra Valley. I mean, this is a guy whose passion for Nebbiolo, I feel, is unparalleled in Australia. Please do feel free to correct me if I'm wrong. But yeah, he grows Nebbiolo in Yarra Valley. Historically has produced some other more classic grape varieties as well, some Chardonnay and Pinot Noir. But really all he wants to do is make Nebbiolo, to the extent that the plan is to stop making the other wines and only make Nebbiolo. Just make the best Nebbiolo that he can make, the best Nebbiolo in Yarra Valley. Yeah, it's a real focus, a real passion. I don't think most other wineries focus on that, a single variety to that extent, but it's pretty impressive. And let's be fair, the Nebbiolo that he makes is pretty awesome. So he's getting something right, that's for sure. Not everyone producing Nebbiolo has that much obsession. So most of these other producers will produce some in conjunction with other grape varieties. Part of the problem with it being a challenging grape variety is that it's not necessarily going to ripen to the same extent every year. It can be one of the earliest grape varieties to bud burst, so it buds quite early, and it can be one of the latest varieties to pick. So you have all of that growing season, which is useful, but it means you've got more risk of spring frost, you've got more risk of bad weather in the autumn when it comes closer to harvest. So it is a gamble. And referencing the variety of styles here, some years that gamble pays off, and you're going to get these really kind of perfumed, concentrated, structured, complex wines, which will be, you know, absolutely amazing. Other years it might not go so right, so we might see some lighter styles being made, or even some rosé styles. I was sort of reading about some rosé Nebbiolo the other day and thinking, well, you know, why would you make a rosé out of this grape variety when it's so highly prized as a red wine? But realistically, if it's been not the best year and the grapes haven't ripened to the right extent, are you going to just not make anything, which isn't really going to be a smart business decision? Or you can at least make a very lovely rosé out of your grapes, even if they aren't necessarily going to be used for red wine production instead. I'm not saying that all Nebbiolo rosé is for that purpose. I'm sure some people just want to make Nebbiolo rosé, but it's an interesting thing to consider. There's always got to be a use for your grapes. There's got to be something you can do if the conditions aren't exactly perfect. So yeah, again, quite a few different climates here. So you've got places like Yarra Valley and Adelaide Hills, again, both more moderate in terms of their climate. And then you've got places that are a bit warmer, Heathcote, McLaren Vale, King Valley. So it's going to be an interesting comparison, I think, in years to come, how Nebbiolo reflects these different growing conditions, but also reflects the different soils. It is, you know, one of those grape varieties that has that ability to give a sense of place. So anyway, maybe in a few years' time, what I'll be doing is an Australian Nebbiolo tasting. I will just talk about all the Nebbiolos. I think that's a way up, yeah. So those were just really a snapshot of a few grape varieties that I think are quite interesting in Australia. There are loads and loads more, as I sort of indicated earlier on. If you have any particular questions about any other grape varieties, do feel free to drop me a line. Here I wanted to just add a little bit in about another type of alternative variety. So it's not just grape varieties that have been brought in from other countries. There's also some that have just been created, invented. So you can see that Australia has a scientific research body, the CSIRO, which have actually spent some time creating new grape varieties designed to be suited again to Australian growing conditions. And this has largely been done by crossing existing grape varieties. So take two different grape varieties, cross-fertilise them, two vinifera grape varieties, of course, and you get a new grape variety. I'm sure it takes a little bit more time and experimentation than that, but you get the idea. Interestingly, with these, they've not really taken off in the same way. You might be looking at that list of words, which are the names of the grape varieties. I should clarify. So Siena, Tarango, Mystique, Rubienne, Tominga, Tyrian are all the names of the grape varieties that have been created. And most of them don't really seem to have a big commercial perspective. The two exceptions are the top two, Siena and Tarango, which have been sort of taken on, adopted by the Brown Brothers winery, which is why you can see the picture of the label there. So Brown Brothers has actually historically been quite experimental in terms of the grape varieties that they grow and they produce. And the two grape varieties that I mentioned, Siena and Tarango, are both black grape varieties making red wines, but sort of filling this criteria that I mentioned earlier, really, kind of fruity, pleasant, probably slightly lighter, easier drinking than some of the grape varieties I've mentioned just now, that are well suited to these growing conditions and make a sort of fruity but not too heavy style of red wine, which is maybe what people are going for these days. Will this continue to be a trend? Are we going to be looking at more creative grape varieties? I don't know. I mean, there's already enough grape varieties in the world to try and remember as it is. But keep an eye out. So here is where I wanted to talk about, in not so much detail, some of the other alternatives. So I mentioned earlier on that it's not just grape varieties that were changing that could be considered alternative, but also some of the grape growing and winemaking. So I've just put a few points here to really consider. Quite a lot of those is to do with grape growing. So organic, biodynamic, natural, sustainable, minimal intervention. Quite a few different terms here. So I'll just kind of try and clarify each. So organic, we're looking at grape growing without synthetic chemicals. This is a thing that is definitely growing in popularity, not just in Australia, but in countries around the world. And the only reason it's alternative is because it reflects a difference to conventional agriculture, which has taken place over the last few decades. If you go back a couple of hundred years, no one had these sprays. But once they'd been invented and they were seen as an easy fix to some of the vineyard problems that were occurring, they became systemic in their use. They would be used every year, they'd be used on every vineyard. And so in that way, they became commonplace. So these alternatives are in a way going back to what grape growing would have been like before that. So arguably not that alternative, just to clarify that. Interestingly, well, I don't know, I always thought organic was a term that was easy to understand. Obviously we have organic fruit and veg, you understand it for your food. Consumers apparently can get a bit confused about it. They're not exactly clear what it means. I mean, and that's not surprising. Most of the wine trade isn't clear about most things. Certification isn't easy. So producers might be operating under organic principles, not be able to state it on the label. So it is a little bit mixed up. But overall, if you're looking at something that is using less chemicals in your vineyard, I mean, really, that can only be a good thing. And again, we can come back to that idea of, climate change, sustainability. It all kind of fits in together. Biodynamic, again, small proportion of growers, as in every country, it does seem to be growing. So biodynamic is similar to organic in terms of the lack of synthetic chemicals, but there are also additional rules in terms of preparations, adherence to the lunar calendar, and a number of other things. So this is actually something that was created in the 1920s. So again, going back to something that actually isn't new, it's just considered alternative now. And despite not being new. It was only in 2004 that the first sort of biodynamic wines in Australia convention was held. So yeah, again, it is actually relatively recently that more biodynamic grapes are being produced. That said, one of the oldest certified biodynamic producers was the Kaleski winery in Barossa Valley. They were in 1998, so a little bit ahead of the curve there. Natural is a very ill-defined term when it comes to winemaking. It's not legally defined in any way and sort of means just an absence of any interference in many cases. Again, this is an even smaller proportion of people who would be doing natural wines. One of the styles that maybe has got a little bit more traction compared to others is the natural sparkling wines, the Pétillant Naturel, Pet Nat, as they're often referred to. And there are a few people making some different styles of those. Sustainability, sustainable practices, yeah, only become more and more important as we're going forward. Winemaking, as with many industries, can be very wasteful, particularly in terms of the amount of water that is needed. And as we've already said, the chemicals that have been used historically, fertilizers that have been used historically, there's actually been a number of things that have meant that wine over the last few decades has turned into an industry that was not actually that good in terms of its environmental impact. So again, it is becoming more and more of a focus, not just in Australia, but around the world. And there are a number of things different wineries are doing. A good example I read about was Cullen, the Cullen winery in Western Australia, who are thinking about kind of every stage of the process. So they're making their bottles more environmentally friendly. Normally this just means a bit lighter. If you think about some of those really thick glass bottles you can get, transporting those only is more expensive and more environmentally costly. Thinking about more, again at Cullen, thinking more about local sourcing of various resources, thinking about how to best manage their waste. All of it ties in together. So changes afoot there as well. Minimal intervention is another not legally defined term, but is used by producers who basically only do what is needed for the grapes or for the wine when it's needed. So rather than have this systematic process, if you do the same thing every year at the same time, you get the same result. It's more about being in tune with the vineyard, the grapes, the wine as it's being produced. And this can kind of tie into sort of sustainable and other organic principles as well. And again, it can result in some styles which some people might describe as funky, but there are some very high quality wines being produced with this ethos, with this idea. In fact, one of the places where this seemed to be a little bit more prevalent maybe than in other places when I was visiting Australia was in the Basket Range area near to Adelaide Hills, which does lead me to mention ever so briefly the Ochota Barrels winery. I don't know if any of you have had any of their wines, but sadly their winemaker passed away in the last couple of weeks, and this guy was an absolute legend. So if it's a winery you're not familiar with, do look them up. Yeah, making some fantastic wines. It was Taras was the name of the owner, a really passionate guy. Had this kind of pizza restaurant in an old church. Just had a great time there. Great maker of cocktails. Great to talk about his wines. Yeah, really cool guy. Anyway, so those were a few grape growing things. A couple of winery things just to mention as well. Alternatives in terms of fermentation vessels, but again, not really new here. Some various instances of amphora being used. So I obviously could not put this amazing picture, the Lethbridge winery, in. So that's some of the staff that work there, hiding behind their various amphora. I mean, this is something that was used way back when, wasn't it? We're talking about some of the original vessels that were used for fermenting wine, which have arguably been in use in some places throughout that time, but are now coming back into fashion in more sort of modern winemaking environments. I guess there's a similar thought behind some of the concrete egg fermenters. Again, reading the other day an article about concrete egg fermenters, and it started with, does any self-respecting winery these days not have a concrete egg fermenter? And I hadn't realised it had quite got to that state, but there you go. So as the name suggests, these are just egg-shaped rather than being sort of typical tanks or squares that you traditionally see. And the argument for this is that the shape actually helps manage the caps during fermentation. So by having something that is more curved, you get a natural kind of movement around of the CO2 that's being produced. All seems very clever, doesn't it? And then the final point I wanted to mention in particular was about oak. So this goes back to the sort of stereotypical style of Australian wines. I think certainly here in the UK, maybe in the other countries where you guys are joining from as well, there is this perception of Australian wines as being sort of big, you know, ripe fruits, high alcohol, full-bodied, sort of sunshine in a glass idea with a big lick of oak as well. And this would apply to the red wines as well, but also to the Chardonnay, where big oaky Chardonnays were the thing a couple of decades ago. Obviously, particularly for Chardonnay, it can be quite a divisive thing. It is potentially the big oaky Chardonnays that became a little bit less popular and sort of ushered in the era of Sauvignon Blanc, which doesn't seem to have left it yet. But this idea that all Australian wines are big and oaky is, again, it's not really true anymore. So managing oak in a way that is, again, considerate, that reflects the style of wine, that reflects the quality of the wine, is really what producers are looking at these days. So that means things like bigger oak vessels, older oak vessels, playing around with the amount of oak that's being used. In Chardonnay, also playing around with the amount of malolactic that is that the wine's going through. So all of these things just kind of serving to rein it back a bit. Like, just think a little bit more about delicate flavours when it comes to Australia now. I know it's maybe not the terms that you're used to, but like, Australia is doing all sorts of wonderful things. So if you are one of those people that's, you know, maybe gone, oh, I'm not sure if I want an Australian wine, aren't they all, you know, big and alcoholic? No, is the answer. I think hopefully I've just proved that pretty much anything is available in Australia these days. So certainly worth having a look around. So that really brings me to the end of everything that I was planning to say. Just wanted to mention a few of the resources that I used here to pull this together. Wines of Australia, very much the biggest one. So they've got their Wines of Australia website, and then also Australian Wine Discovered, which is their educational resource. So if you have any interest in Australian wine at all, this is a free educational resource which covers all the key elements of Australian wine production. Latest statistics you can find through their websites as well. Just really useful, really well presented, and yeah, very helpful resource. Otherwise, a few other things that are useful. I did download James Busby's book from 1825 on my Kindle. It's, as I said earlier, I think it's just really impressive. It's kind of starts out with his account of getting to Australia, realising that there was this gap in the market, and then how he went about getting grapes from various countries, learning how to make wine. yeah, very, very interesting. James Halliday's website, Wine Companion, also very useful resource, lots of information on there. He's the kind of go-to guy when it comes to Australia, really. And then a bit of Jancis Robinson's Oxford Companion as well, which is just the go-to book for any wine information, really. So yeah, a few different things that might be of use to you there. So that brings me to the end of the presentation, really. If you are interested in sharing any posts on social media, there are all of our handles here which you can access. It's very nice to see, you know, tweets and instas and whatnot. I will leave that up to you. And obviously we are, WSET School London is still open for all classes currently. So whether that's wine, spirits, Zarco or anything else you've got an interest in, you can find more details on our website. So that's it from me. I'm going to end the recording here.